Those disciples are just so relentlessly human. The commentaries that I have read in preparation for today want us to be reminded of our call to protect and defend and lift up the oppressed. The little child represents the most oppressed in Jesus' time. And indeed, the call to protect and defend and lift up the oppressed is a righteous reminder. It's the right thing to do. The gospel message, the message of the Hebrew scriptures, the message of so many other sacred texts and traditions around the world tell us to do this. And if we put it to a vote right now amongst all of us gathered here, my guess is that the outcome would be unanimous. Yes, let us protect and defend and lift up the oppressed. But nevertheless, the tricky part is how to pull that off. And each of the readings really grapples with how to balance that. You know, I gotta believe that the disciples on the road who were arguing about who was the greatest were doing so, yes, out of ego, but also out of great love. Don't we all want to be the best, the very best, the most highly acclaimed, the award winners when it comes to doing the right thing? The what would Jesus do right thing? I do. And yet I have to say that the first reading today was a tough one. I confess I read it many times, and it was very tempting to side with those who are greatly annoyed by the so-called just, who oppose and reproach. Perhaps you have come across some of those just who oppose and reproach. I've seen and I've even smirked at a bumper sticker that reads, "Dear God, please protect me from your followers." Before the liturgy began, we were discussing the vaccine, the COVID vaccine. And there was a story that I heard this week, a true story that I learned about because a letter got written to the hospital, a letter of complaint got written to the hospital that there was a patient who came to the hospital sick with something not COVID. And they were being, there was an encounter between that patient and one of the staff. And the staff saw that this patient was two things about the patient. One, the patient was a healthcare provider and the patient had not yet been vaccinated. And the staff person then began to do a full-out finger wag, chastising that patient. And, you know, I can so see both sides. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I was vaccinated. I'm promoting the vaccine. And yet also, how must it have felt for that patient to come full of all kinds of vulnerability when you're a patient and you're sitting there in your Johnny and you've left your belongings in one of those green plastic bags in a bag, you know what I mean? You get the picture. To be chastised by someone who's standing there in a lab coat with a computer and a clipboard and looks so official. We have to be careful about our righteousness. And I think the readings get at that when they talk about gentleness. Perhaps a pitfall that we might want to avoid when we're trying to follow the way of Jesus is to be careful about that. I'm not talking about allowing oppression to happen because we want to be all careful and walk on eggshells. I'm not talking about that. I think you know what I'm talking about. if we follow the example of Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Mother Teresa, who used that kind of gentleness and reason and understanding and alongside of fervent caring. It's interesting that MLK and Gandhi were both assassinated for their beliefs. So anyhow, the letter of James is interesting because it suggests that we might just ask God with humility and then be open to the wisdom from above, which is first of all pure, peaceable, gentle, compliant, full of mercy, good fruits. We might just ask God with humility. How do we grapple with these things that are so difficult to grapple with? We might just ask God. It's telling that in the gospel story at the beginning of it, the disciples hear Jesus talk about his own betrayal and death and rising, but don't understand him and are afraid to ask. I take great hope in the prayer of the psalm, which reminds us and me, it reminds me, I'll say, that God is my helper, the one who sustains my life. Let me never be afraid to ask God. And I also take great hope in the words and actions of Jesus that remind me that even when I get it wrong, even when my eagerness to be the best crosses over the line and becomes ego-driven and even approaches sinfulness, if I but ask, Jesus will put his arms around me like a little child and tell me to look around. Where are the other little children? Aren't we all little children? Who needs me the most? Who is the Christ that I am called to receive today? And so when I and we and our community and the world is the most relentlessly human, may we remember to ask. May we be open to those other humans and other creatures too, for that matter, whom God has placed right in front of us to learn from, to receive, to love, to lift up.